Hi, I'm Bob Tabor with www.learnvisualstudio.net. In this module, we're going to talk about Microsoft Azure SQL. I may have to apologize to the marketing folks right up front. I think they've rebranded this a couple of times, and I'm not exactly sure which name I should be calling it by. I've seen it called Microsoft Azure SQL, Azure SQL, Azure SQL Database, Microsoft Azure SQL Database, and so on. However, essentially what we're talking about is the relational database management system SQL Server hosted by Microsoft in the cloud. This is actually a subset of all the features that you would find from the full version of SQL Server. Now, yes, you could go about spinning up your own virtual machine that is hosting Windows Server, and you could install the on-premise version of SQL Server and configure it in the cloud but using virtual machines. That's not what we're talking about in the next couple of modules. We're talking about the Microsoft configured and hosted version of SQL Server. It has a reduced set of functionality. However, it boasts things like high availability. You get several copies of your database, automatic backups, low learning curve if you're coming from SQL Server, inexpensive starting point. You can begin as low as $15 and then scale up as you need it. Elastic capacity, so you can add additional capacity and features as needed. And then finally, it boasts low management overhead. So this goes to that mantra that we've been talking about throughout this entire series of courses. Less configurability, yes, but also less responsibility. It's just a trade-off of how much you want to control versus how much you're willing to take on in terms of responsibility. So let's talk about what you get and what you don't get. We'll start with what you get. First of all, you get the core functionality of SQL Server. Tables, views, store procedures. You can create roles and put users in roles just like you can in SQL Server. You get Transact SQL functionality, both DML and DDL, but on a limited basis, and we'll talk about that in depth here in just a moment. You get automatic backups. You can add optional auditing. I think some of the higher level plans for Azure SQL allow for auditing. You can monitor the health of your database. You can set up geo-replication around the world. We're going to spend a whole module on just that topic here in a couple of modules from now. And then you can also use the client tools that you already know. So SQL Server Management Studio, you can use Visual Studio, especially if you have the data tools installed. Also, there's an online administration application that you can use, and we'll demo all that in the very next module. All right, so let's talk about what you lose, and that's actually a little bit of a longer story. So let me pop open this URL that you see on screen right now. This will take you to a page called Azure SQL Database Transact SQL Reference, and there are several things that you can take a look at. Here are the features that are supported. Here are the features that are partially supported. And then here are the features that are not supported in SQL Database, Azure SQL. And these look like they come in categories of Transact SQL features, like features that rely on the SQL Server agent or MSDB jobs. And so you might find that there are other ways to accomplish these sorts of things in Azure, but they're not available in the strictest sense that they're available in the on-premise version of SQL Server. Features that rely upon the log reader, replication, change data capture, things of that nature. Some of these, what I would consider advanced features that most of the time are important to database administrators, less important to developers like me. And then you can just go down the line here. So if you have a scenario where you use features that are outside of what I would call the core set of features. So some more of the advanced features, you may not find them here. However, as we'll point out at the very end, there's active development going on, and every time there's a new release of Azure SQL, new features are brought on, and we begin to get more parity between what's available on premise and what's available in the cloud. So let's move on then and continue talking about pricing for just a moment. And here, let's take a look at another web page. You can see the link there on the slide, and there are several different tiers. There are also two other tiers that are no longer available: Web and Business. They've been deprecated, but if you already have some databases out there, you can keep them in those plans. However, these are the ones that are available for new databases at this point. You can see that really the differences come in terms of the amount of capacity that you get, the amount of functionality that you'll get, and then most importantly is the performance that you get. Now, there's this notion of database throughput units, or DTUs, and a DTU is a relative capacity of performance, and so you can compare the basic versus standard versus premium databases. DTUs are based on a blended measure of how much CPU you get, how much memory you get, how many reads and writes can be performed in a given period of time. So as DTUs increase, as you can see, you go from the basic to the premium tier, the power offered by the performance level increases as well. So for example, a performance level with 5 DTUs has 5 times more power than a performance level with a 1 DTU. And so there's a maximum DTU that applies to each server, as you can see right here. And there's another page I want you to take a look at, and here's the link on screen about performance level specifics. And if you scroll down, you can see that there's this chart here that talks about the different DTUs and database sizes, and then also how many worker threads, the max number of connections or sessions that you get, the benchmark transaction rate, and the predictability of performance. And I would encourage you to read this entire article regarding these performance level specifics. So at this point, it might look like we're working with a whole different product, and to some extent that's true. And you might wonder then, when would you choose Azure SQL over an on-premise SQL Server installation? And I think I want to reference you to one last link here, and that's the link that you see on screen right now. It's an article called SQL Database and SQL Server Performance Scalability Compared and Contrasted, and there's a lot of good information in here, but I'm going to ask you to scroll down to the section that's called Expectations for Azure SQL Database. And they lay out the case for each one here and what the differences are in terms of performance. And it really comes down to 3 different considerations. First of all, you have to remember that in Azure SQL you're in a multi-tenant environment, so your database is one of many that are sitting on the same database server. And so you can expect some performance degradation than if you had dedicated equipment on your own in your own data center that was serving up this data. You're sharing it with other consumers, and you're going to get a slice of the overall performance. So you've got to keep that in mind. Also, in Azure SQL, the database servers are sitting on commodity hardware, not fine-tuned, high-performance software or hardware necessarily. Some organizations spend a lot of money fine-tuning and spending a lot of money on the hardware that will accommodate a specific data retrieval performance level. And you have to keep in mind that you're not getting that when you're using Azure SQL. And then also what they call tier latency, and that is the amount of time that it takes between, let's say, Azure websites to communicate with your Azure SQL database. In your own data center, these might be sitting on computers or machines that are very close to each other. They're not making a lot of hops through a convoluted system of routers and such. They're sitting very close to each other, and so they say that there could be several milliseconds of latency when you're working with Azure SQL between other tiers and the Azure SQL database itself. So in other words, we're talking about probably a less performant version of Azure SQL than what you could build on your own. However, I think that this still has a lot of appeal for many of us who are not creating mission critical systems that we're trying to squeeze every millisecond out of. So it's great for things like startups who just need a quick win, quick presence online. They can create an application very quickly and easily and not really worry about acquiring money for high-end servers to be performant. They can just throw their ideas up on Azure SQL and get started very quickly, and then scale up from there as they need to. It's also great within larger organizations for any departmental applications or non-critical line of business applications. So not every application demands a high degree of performance. If you're serving it up to just a dozen users or even a couple of dozen users, you may not need all the expense that goes into creating a huge server farm just to serve up that application. Not every application needs the highest possible end servers to host it. It's also great for worldwide reach whenever you have employees or people that need to access the data from around the world. There are some, we're going to demonstrate something called Azure SQL Sync. I may have the term a little bit off there, but it allows you to create replicas around multiple data centers around the world, and so multiple people in your organization from around the world can access the data. And that might be a little bit more difficult for you to do. If you're creating an on-premise data center, you'd have to spend a lot of money to set up data centers around the world to accomplish the same thing. And then finally, it's great for a plan B. So you can have your main data store inside your own data centers, but then be backing up or syncing that database regularly with one online, so that if you have a catastrophic failure on your own premise, you can then switch over to the Azure SQL version of the database. And like I said a little bit earlier, Azure SQL is going under heavy development, very active development, and so every month it seems like there are new features that are coming online. So just because it doesn't support a feature today doesn't mean that you're always going to be locked out of Azure SQL. You might just want to check back in a couple weeks or just keep your eye on their blog post to see if it has the feature set that you need within your organization. All right, so there is one last URL. I'll show it here on screen. And this is what I would call the definitive way to get started with Azure SQL. It's going to show you how to create a new SQL database. It's going to show you how to connect to it from various tools, how to run Transact SQL statements using the online management portal and things of that nature. And I'm going to essentially do those same sorts of tasks and maybe even add a couple on. In the very next module, I'll cover the typical use cases, and then beyond that, we're going to talk about some things that are a little bit outside of the normal basic course of events that you would expect to see. So things like importing and exporting databases and various migration strategies that are available to help you do that. Backing up and restoring databases. And then we're going to spend a module talking about the different kinds of redundancy that are available in Azure SQL. We'll talk about the difference between active georeplication versus standard georeplication and what the difference is. All right, and finally I'm going to point you to, for the next steps, to take a look at this definitive getting started guide on Azure's own documentation. It'll talk about getting started with setting up a new Azure SQL database, setting up firewall permissions for your IP address where you're currently logged in from, working with the online version of the management SQL management portal, I guess you could say, how to run Transact SQL statements in that portal, and so on. And we're actually going to do the very same things in the next module. I'll just demonstrate many of the concepts that are discussed here. In addition to that, we're going to talk about several things beyond just the basics. We're going to look at migrating your database. So taking an existing database that you have on premise and then migrating it to the cloud. So importing it into Azure SQL. And then we're going to talk about backup and recovery. We're going to talk about Azure SQL or Azure SQL Data Sync, that feature that I talked about where you can sync on-premise databases with databases in Azure SQL, not just in one data center, but also around the world. And so we'll begin that in the very next module, and we'll see you there. Thank you.